She set it on my desk at 4:53 on a Friday afternoon. One page. Her name at the top. The date. 2 paragraphs of language so formal and precise it could only have been written by someone who drafts things the way other people breathe, carefully, completely, with total awareness of every word's weight. At the bottom, her signature. The one I'd seen on 1,000 documents in 3 years. The one that meant, this is finished, this is real, this is mine. I looked at it. I looked at her. She was still standing on the other side of my desk with her hands at her sides and her face arranged into something neutral and executive and entirely unreadable, which is a face I knew, which is the face she wore when she had already made a decision and was waiting to see what the world did with it. She said, "I want you to read it before I say anything else." I read it. It said she was resigning, effective 30 days from today, with gratitude for the opportunity and respect for the organization and confidence in the team she was leaving behind. It said everything a resignation letter is supposed to say, and nothing that explained why a woman who had built this division from 11 people to 43, who had shepherded every significant win of the last 4 years, who had told me 8 weeks ago over bad conference coffee that she intended to retire from this company, nothing that explained why that woman was standing on the other side of my desk at 4:53 on a Friday, with her face arranged into something I couldn't read. I set it down. I said, "Why?" She said, "That's not the question I'm here for." I looked at her. She said, "The question I'm here for is whether you're going to ask me to stay." Her name was Renata Souls, 51 years old, 22 years at the company, the last 7 in the role she currently occupied, which was Senior Director of Operations, and also, in the more accurate informal taxonomy, the person without whom nothing worked. She had started as a coordinator, which everyone who met her now found mildly shocking, and had built her way up through a combination of precision and an almost unreasonable willingness to understand systems at the level most people outsource to someone else. She understood how things connected, not just in the abstract, in the specific, granular, load-bearing way that meant when something broke, she was the one who knew which wire to touch. I had been her deputy for 3 years. Technically her report, though the org chart had always felt approximate where Renata was concerned, less a hierarchy and more a structure she moved through at will. Because her authority was not positional, it was earned, and earned authority doesn't stop at org chart lines. I had learned more in 3 years under her than in the preceding 6 years of my career combined. And I was aware of that the way you're aware of a debt you're not sure how to repay. She was not warm in the way people use that word. She was not soft. She did not do the performative mentorship of leaders who need to be seen mentoring, the office door open, the check-in calendared, the feedback delivered in the specific cadence of a TED Talk. What she did was something harder to name. She put you in rooms you weren't ready for, and stood close enough that you didn't fail. And then the next time, she stood a little further away, and eventually you looked up, and she was at the back of the room entirely, and you were handling it, and you both understood that something had transferred. She had done this with me. I was still in the process of understanding how completely. I had no idea she was unhappy. That is the thing I need to say plainly. Before anything else, I had been in the same division as this woman for 3 years, working within 10 feet of her most days, and I had not known, which is either a failure of my attention or a measure of how completely she had managed what she let be seen, and I have thought about which of those it is and landed somewhere uncomfortably between them. I picked up the letter. I set it down again. I said, "I'm not going to ask you to stay without understanding why you want to leave." She said, "That's not the order. The order matters to you. The order is the whole point." I sat back. I looked at her. She looked at me, the same neutral executive face, except something behind it that I was only now, with a letter on the desk between us, learning to read. Something she had been sitting with for long enough that sitting with it had become indistinguishable from composure. I said, "How long have you been thinking about this?" 6 weeks. 6 weeks. I did the math without wanting to. 6 weeks ago was the restructure announcement. This is about the restructure. She said nothing. Which was its own answer. The restructure had come from above both of us. A reorganization of reporting lines that made operational sense on paper, and that Renata had flagged in review with specific documented concerns, and that had been approved anyway. Her division would stay intact. Her team would stay. Her role would stay. In title and in compensation. What would change was the reporting structure. Instead of reporting to the chief operating officer, she would report to a newly created layer of senior leadership that everyone understood was a buffer. A political solution to a problem that wasn't hers, but that she would nonetheless live inside. She had said, in the meeting where it was finalized, exactly one sentence, "I want the record to reflect my concerns." She had said it quietly. She had said it and moved on, and I had thought, I had believed, that she had processed it and made peace with it, and was doing what Renata did, which was adapt. She had not made peace with it. She had been sitting with a resignation letter for 6 weeks. I stood up. I went to the window. Our office is on the 14th floor, and the city below had the particular Friday afternoon quality of a place that is already mentally elsewhere, and I stood there for a moment thinking about what I was doing and what I was about to do. Then I turned around. I said, "Tell me what the letter doesn't say." Something shifted in her face. Small, the first crack in the executive composure, which was not weakness. It was the specific expression of someone who has been waiting to be asked the right question and has just been asked it. She sat down, which she hadn't done. She sat in the chair across from my desk, and she put her hands on the arms of it, and she said, "The letter doesn't say that I have spent 22 years building something here, that I have given this organization the specific best version of my thinking for more than 2 decades, and that the restructure is the first time I have felt that to be not respected, not disrespected, seen and then set aside, which is different and which is worse." She said, "It doesn't say that I know what the new layer is. I've seen it before. It's a waiting room, and I am not a person who waits in rooms." She said, "It doesn't say that I have known for 6 weeks that if the person who should have said something to leadership didn't say it, I was going to have to leave, because staying under those conditions would mean becoming a smaller version of myself, and I have never done that, and I won't start now." I said, "Who is the person who should have said something?" She looked at me. I said, "Say it plainly." "Renata." She said, "You had standing I didn't have. You were inside the decisions in a way I wasn't. You could have pushed back in rooms I wasn't in, and made a case I couldn't make for myself without it looking like self-interest. A beat. I don't know if you knew that." I said, "I didn't push back." "I know. I should have." She said, "That's what I'm here to find out." I want to be honest about what happened in me when she said that. Not defensiveness. I expected defensiveness, and it didn't come. What came instead was something quieter and more uncomfortable. The specific feeling of understanding a thing you had technically known and had not fully let yourself know. I had been inside those restructure conversations. I had seen the new layer proposed, and I had registered Renata's concerns, and I had decided, somewhere in the processing of it, that it was above my level to contest. that my role was to implement rather than to obstruct, that advocating too hard would cost me something in rooms I was still trying to establish myself in. I had made a calculation. I had made it quickly and filed it and moved on, and what it had cost was standing in front of me with a resignation letter and a question about whether I knew what I'd done. I said, I made a calculation. She waited. I decided the risk wasn't mine to take, that it was above my level, that pushing back would cost me in rooms I couldn't afford to lose standing in. I looked at her. I convinced myself I was being strategic. I think I was being afraid. Something in her face. Not satisfaction, the opposite of satisfaction. The expression of someone who had hoped for a different answer and also known this was the true one. She said, I know the difference between strategic and afraid. You know I know. Yes, and you still need to hear, I'm not here to punish you for it. I'm here because the situation is repairable, and I need to know if you understand it before I can believe the repair. I said, what does repair look like? She said, it looks like you going back into those rooms. Not to undo the decision, that's done, and I'm not asking for reversal. Going back to make a different case. That the new layer is a resource question, not a command question. That I report to the COO on strategy and the new layer on administrative integration, not the other way around. It's a distinction that sounds small and is not small. I said, I can make that case. She said, I know you can. I taught you how. The following Tuesday, I requested time with the COO. I want to tell you it was easy. It was not easy. The restructure was finalized, and finalized things have gravity. And asking for a conversation about a finalized decision in the first month of implementation is the kind of thing that can be read as instability, as a deputy who doesn't know where his lane is, as a disruption arriving from below, dressed as a clarification. I requested the time anyway. I made the case Renata had described, not in her words, in mine, built from the 3 years of learning her thinking closely enough that I knew which arguments had load-bearing weight and which ones were scaffolding. I made it specific. I made it operational. I made it about function rather than feeling, which is the only way a structural argument survives a room full of people who made the original structure. The COO listened. She asked 3 questions. She said she would take it to the broader leadership group. 4 days later, 4 days that I spent in a specific kind of suspended state, going about my work, while one part of my brain tracked the silence the way you track a thing that is either a weather system or nothing. I got a calendar invite. All hands restructure review. 12 people. Friday morning, I texted Renata, Friday morning, full review. She replied in 40 seconds, 2 words. I see you. The review took 2 hours. I will not reconstruct the whole of it because the whole of it is not the point. What is the point is that the distinction held. The operational argument held. The reporting line was adjusted. Strategy and divisional direction through the COO. Administrative integration through the new layer, with explicit documentation that the former took precedence over the latter in any conflict. It was not everything Renata had wanted. It was not a reversal. It was what I had told the COO it was. A distinction that sounds small and is not small. It was enough to make the job worth doing. Enough to make staying worth the cost of considering leaving. On Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after she had set the letter on my desk, she came to my office. She stood in the doorway. She was not carrying anything. She said, I owe you something. I said, you don't. She said, let me finish. She came in. She sat across from my desk again, the same chair, the same room, 7 days of compressed everything between the two versions of it. I came to you last Friday with a letter and a condition. The condition was that you had to ask me to stay before I explained anything. I want to tell you why. I waited. She said, because I needed to know if you valued the thing before you understood the problem. It's easy to retain someone once you know what's at stake. It's a different thing entirely to say don't go before you have all the information, based only on what you already know about what they're worth. She looked at me steadily. I needed to know you saw me, not what I could tell you about the situation. Me, she said. You didn't ask me to stay. I said no. You asked me why instead, which is not what I asked for. A pause. It's what I needed. I looked at her. I said, is that good or bad? She said, it means you didn't need the condition. You were already doing the real thing. She stood up. The letter is rescinded. Formally, as of today. She moved toward the door. Don't make me write another one. I said, Renata. She stopped. I said, I'm sorry I didn't push back in those rooms. I'm going to be better at that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, without turning around, I know you are. I've been watching you learn how. She paused at the door. That's why I gave you the chance to. She walked out. Here is what I understand now that I didn't understand the Friday she set that letter on my desk. The resignation was not the last resort. It was the test, not a manipulation. I want to be precise about this, because those are different things and she was not a manipulative person. A test is what you administer when you need real information, and only a real situation will produce it. She needed to know, before she could make the decision about whether to stay or go, whether the person she'd spent 3 years developing understood what had been built between them well enough to act on it without a brief. She had given me everything. 3 years of rooms and distances, and standing closer, and standing further back, and eventually standing at the back while I handled it. She had poured 22 years of understanding into the small specific transfer that is real mentorship. The kind without a calendar invite or a name. And the one thing she could not give me, the one thing I had to produce on my own, was the knowledge of what that was worth. She needed to see if I'd learned that. Not the work. The other thing, the understanding that some people are weight-bearing, and that when weight-bearing people leave, what they take is not replaceable on a timeline that doesn't hurt. I didn't ask her to stay. I asked her why. In the economy of that moment, asking why was the more honest thing. It was not performing the retention. It was actually doing it. Trying to understand before trying to solve. It was, I think, the first time in 3 years that the learning she'd been doing in me became visible to both of us at the same time. She saw it. She rescinded the letter. I still have it. She left it on the desk. I don't know if that was intentional. I think it was intentional. There is someone who has been pouring into you. A boss. A mentor. A colleague. A person who has been standing close enough that you don't fail, and then stepping back and watching you handle it. And you have been receiving it without fully naming what it is. Because naming it would require you to name the debt. And the debt is large enough that looking at it directly feels like too much. And they know you haven't named it. They are watching to see when you will. When did someone last give you more than their job required? More than the role? More than the title? More than the meeting on the calendar? And did you say so? Did you go back into the room you were afraid of, on their behalf, because they had already done it for you 100 times and you finally understood that? What is the weight-bearing thing in your life that you have not yet told anyone is weight-bearing? And what happens to everything built on it if you wait until it hands you a letter to find out? Subscribe. These are the stories about the debt we owe the people who built us.